because you need Indiana to keep winning if they're going to make the college football playoff. And that is our next segment. Can Indiana make the college football playoff? People were laughing. People were saying I was crazy. And I don't blame people for thinking that. This is Indiana. I never was really high on Indiana, though. I was just saying if they keep winning, they'll have a shot. But now people are starting to believe, because we're seeing Indiana rise up in the rankings. They're right now at number 13 in the AP poll. So they're right outside where you need to be ranked to make the 12-team playoff. You need to be in the top 11, basically, for the most part, to make the college football playoff at the very least, because obviously the 12th team is going to go to the Group of 5 champion. Unless in some weird scenario it would somehow be the Big 12 or ACC, but it should be the Group of 5. But Indiana's right there. And they just got this massive win over Nebraska, which definitely helps out their resume, strength of record, a lot of these statistics that matter for the college football playoff. I mean, because they're not barely winning. They are blowing out teams. If they were barely beating teams like Northwestern and Maryland and Nebraska, then that would look bad, because like, oh, well, Indiana's beating these teams, but they're not beating these teams by a lot. And these aren't really good teams, except Nebraska. I still think that they're pretty solid overall, even though my confidence is shaking in them a little bit after they got destroyed by Indiana. Still think Nebraska's pretty solid. But these other teams, though, not that great. But Indiana is winning big, so that helps that they are blowing out these teams. So even though Indiana's schedule's been pretty light, not too tough, I still think that overall you have to look at Indiana and say that they are a legit contender for the playoff as long as they keep winning. I think that they really can only afford one loss. If they lose to Ohio State, second to last week of the regular season, and they don't have any other losses, Indiana should make the college football playoff at 11-1. Now, if they made the Big Ten title game in that scenario and then they lost that game and went 11-2, that would be interesting. I still think you'd probably have to put them in, because your only two losses would be to Ohio State and probably Oregon or Ohio State again. I mean, in that scenario, but we don't know how all this is going to work out. Indiana maybe could go 11-1 and then not even make the Big Ten title game, because if Oregon could win out, because they'd have the tiebreaker over Indiana. So an 11-1 Indiana, they're in. They're in the playoff no matter what. An 11-2 Indiana, maybe it would get dicey. A 10-2 Indiana, a team with maybe a loss in this game to Washington and Ohio State, or Michigan and Ohio State, or even Michigan State and Ohio State, probably not going to get in, because their resume would not be strong enough, and there probably would be enough two-loss teams that would have way better resumes, way better brand power, that they would leave Indiana out of the college football playoff. But Indiana does have a legit shot to make it. And right now, they're, according to the FBI, being given a 63% chance to make the college football playoff, which at the beginning of the season, 0.6% chance. So their odds have risen higher than any other team's odds. No one thought that they would be here, including myself. I thought when I predicted them in the preseason to go 7-5, thought they would lose probably 2 games right now. I thought they'd probably lose 2 games. I think I had them losing to Maryland, and I had them losing to Nebraska. And then in the final stretch, I had them losing to Michigan, obviously, Ohio State, and I think Washington. So those would have been the 7-5 record, the 5 losses, and then the other games, all 7 of them would have been wins. But they're 7-0. They've taken care of business. They've done a whole lot better than even I thought and everybody else thought. But now everybody's jumping on board, and that's great. But now this is going to start getting tough for Indiana, because for one thing, now you got the national eyeballs, because you just had Big Noon Kickoff against Nebraska. They aced that test, but now you've got College Game Day coming to the next game, and we're going to get to that game. We're about to preview the Washington game coming up, but then you're going to have those big games against Ohio State and even Michigan. I still think that's a really big game, despite the fact that Michigan is playing awful football right now. They're still Michigan. They still have a lot of talent. Indiana cannot overlook that team as well. You can't overlook Michigan ever, no matter how bad they're playing. And Michigan State's not going to be super easy on the road. And you can't forget the spoiler makers. Purdue is playing garbage football, but you just never know. Point is that Indiana has to treat every opponent like they can be beat, that Indiana can lose to these teams. Every team can beat every team. Signetti, I trust him in the fact that I believe he's going to have the team ready every single game, and to not overlook anybody and to not get too high or too low, which is great to see. That's why against Nebraska, they didn't get too high, too low, and they just dominated. But now you've got a different quarterback in there. Could change things up a little bit with Taven Jackson. But it's going to be interesting. But yes, Indiana can make the playoff. That's the answer to this question on screen on the banner. Yes, Indiana can make the playoff. It's not no longer a question of is it a miracle or is it a long shot? No, it's not even a long shot. Indiana's got a great shot. All they got to do is just basically win out, and you can afford to lose to Ohio State. Beat everybody besides Ohio State, and you're going to make the college football playoff. And right now, they are favored to do that, which is why their odds are at 63%. But if they lose to a team like Washington, they lose to a team like Michigan State, then you're going to have to probably beat Ohio State, which would be almost impossible. But you never know. Anything's possible in football. We've seen some crazy upsets this year. But Indiana hasn't beaten Ohio State since the 80s. It will be very tough, but you never know. Oregon was able to do it. So, obviously, that game was an odds, and the Indiana game against Ohio State would be in Columbus. So, pretty much you would say impossible. But, again, with what Indiana's done so far, nothing is impossible. The Hoosiers can make the playoff. They just have to keep on winning, can't overlook any opponent, and hopefully with Taven Jackson being in there, that will not complicate things at all, and they can keep on winning.